All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Before we get into the book, I gotta do a couple plugs here. First, I was just watching this Jay Dyer versus Ryan Dawson debate. I would say that this is a really good debate to check out if you're interested in the theism versus atheism debate. They both lay out their cases very even-handedly, and it's a very respectful debate, I would say. So if you're interested in those topics, they pretty much cover all the points, all the main points of that debate in this debate. So check that out, link in the description. And I wanted to talk about these Alex Jones creatine gummies. I got some. Yeah, I know they're like super expensive though. But I was kind of skeptical about them because I took some creatine like a long time ago that I got at the grocery store. Didn't really do much, but I gotta say, these are actually pretty powerful. I haven't like slept in days after taking them. Like I'd be sleeping like 2 hours a day now. And then when I'm about to like pass out, I just take the creatine gummies. And then like a half hour later, you just like wake back up and then like go do like weightlifting sets and stuff like that. Kind of ridiculous. Kind of ridiculous. I guess it's cheaper if you buy 3 bottles. I don't know if I can do all that though. But yeah, I mean, I got them right here. And as far as them being gummies, I mean, I guess you could say they're gummies. It's kind of more like a Starburst though. Kinda. I don't know. It's good though. It tastes good. It tastes like sour apple, like a Jolly Rancher or whatever. So I don't know. I would say check it out, but they are pretty expensive though. But also, I just wanted to talk about for a second, why I even support Alex Jones, because I know like nowadays it's pretty popular to like hate on Alex Jones, especially after the whole like whatever trial thing or whatever, right? But I don't know. The way I kind of see it is that, a lot of us, if not the majority of us conspiracy theorist type people, have talked about either that specific topic or some other topic very similar to that, right? I mean, look at Candace Owens right now. I mean, if you look at what she's doing with Erica Kirk, I mean, if what she's saying is proven false, she should get hit with a huge lawsuit, like a huge, like career destroying, basically turn you into like a government slave type of lawsuit, right? Like the same type of thing that they got Alex Jones on, right? And so people are like, oh, well, he changed his messaging. Well, yeah, he now has to have a lawyer basically sitting next to him the whole time while he's on the show. Like, it's pretty bad. I mean, can you imagine getting a lawsuit that's that bad where now you have to have like a lawyer just sitting next to you while you talk to make sure that you're not saying anything quote unquote illegal, even though we're supposed to have free speech or whatever. So to me, people can diss him all day or whatever, but it's like that could have happened to any of us. And the fact that he's so successful is the reason why they targeted him. And that, to me, that just seems unfair. Like the only reason why other channels that were saying the same thing didn't get a $50 million lawsuit was because they just weren't as successful. So they saw him as someone who's like a target. It's like basically like a buck breaking type of situation where they take like the biggest, most powerful guy and beat him up in front of everybody. And then everybody else is just like, well, crap. I mean, if you took the biggest, toughest guy and just beat him up, what are we going to do? And it did have that kind of a chilling effect on the conspiracy community, right? Where people were just like, well, maybe they are all real. Maybe it all is happening, right? Maybe we just shouldn't talk about that. And like people change their language and all this other stuff, right? And like, it's obvious like Trump is helping him out. So that's why he supports Trump. He obviously knows Trump. Like he's not bullshitting about that, right? Like he does know Trump. Trump was on the show. I mean, Roger Stone is on the show all the time. Roger Stone knows Trump, definitely knows Trump, right? So people could say it's just fake and he's just saying stuff or whatever, but it seems pretty realistic to me. At least it seems highly plausible that, that's what's going on. That basically, Trump is helping him out in some fashion from all these crazy government attacks. And that's why he supports Trump. And, the other stuff, I mean, people say he doesn't talk about Zionists. He does, though. He talks about it all the time. It's not the only thing that he talks about. So, that's why I still support him. And plus, he's like basically running like a public service. He's like one of very few people on the internet that will basically talk to anyone, let him call in, and he doesn't just like hang up on him. He's like, oh, what'd you say? Oh, I didn't like what you said. I'm just going to hang up on you. You're dumb. That's what most people do, right? Most people that have call-in shows, as soon as you say one thing that they disagree with or they think is dumb, they just hang up on you, right? And he's also willing to have basically almost any person representing any specific topic, right? Like, I'm not saying he'll have anyone on the show, but if you have someone with a high enough caliber on a specific topic, whatever the topic is, he'll bring him on the show and talk to him. I think he's proven that time and time again. He's brought on Democrats, Republicans, alien people, creationists. He covers a wide spectrum of topics. So I try to give him some credit for that type of stuff. But all right, we're going to get into the book. We're on page 614, still on the disruption of Europe, 1937 to 1939. A new constitution was declared under the Emergency Economic Decree Power of 1917. On April 24th, 1934, it changed Austria from a democratic republic to a Christian, German, corporative federal state. This constitution was both fraudulent and illegal, and Dollfuss's efforts to make it more legal, if not less fraudulent, had the opposite result. Dollfuss had signed a concordat with the Vatican in June 1933. Since the Holy See wanted this agreement to be approved by Parliament, Dollfuss decided to kill several birds with one stone by convoking a rump of the old Parliament to accept this document, to terminate the disrupted session of March 4th, 1933, and to accept the 471 decrees he had issued since that date. Among these decrees was a new constitution of 1934. Since the government insisted that the old constitution had never been suspended or even violated, the new one had to be accepted either by a plebiscite or by 2/3 vote of the old parliament, with at least half of its members present. This was done on April 30th, 1934, the various acts being accepted by a fraction of the old parliament. Because the socialists were prevented from attending and the Pan-Germans refused to attend, only 76 out of 165 were present, and some of these voted against the acts proposed. The new constitution was of no importance because the government continued to rule by decree and violated it as it pleased. For example, the decree of June 19, 1934, deprived the courts of their constitutional power to rule on the constitutionality of all the government's acts before July 1st, 1934. The corporative aspect of the new constitution was a complete fraud. In many activities, no corporations were set up. Where they were set up, members were appointed and not elected as provided in law, and in any case, they did nothing. Instead, the whole banking and industrial system was filled with the petty bureaucrats of the Fatherland Front. Because of mismanagement and the World Depression, the banks of Austria collapsed in 1931 to 1933, precipitating the World Bank crisis. The Austrian government took over these banks and gradually replaced their personnel, especially Jewish personnel, by party hacks. Since the banks controlled about 90% of the country's industrial corporations, these party hacks were able to place their friends throughout the economic system. By 1934, almost nothing could be done in the business world without friends in the government, and anything could be done with friends. They're saying that in quotes. Such friendships was best obtained by bribery. With the result that the periodical payments were being made from business to political figures. Oh, so bribes. You mean bribes. Early in 1936, the scandal broke when it was revealed that the Phoenix Insurance Company, of which Vaugoin, ex-chancellor and leader of the Christian Socialist Party, was now president, had lost $250 million in gifts and loans corruptly given. The government had to admit this and published a list of political groups and politicians who had received a total of less than 3 million shillings. This left most of the loss unexplained. It remained unexplained to the end. Legal proceedings were begun against 27 persons, but the Schuschnigg government never brought any of them to trial. This corruption spread throughout the government until finally a point was reached where, as Starhemberg put it, no one knew whom he could trust, and there was justification for harboring the most amazing suspicions. Outrages by the Nazis increased in May and June 1934 to the point where bombings were averaging 15 a day. On July 12th, by decree, the government fixed the death penalty for such bombings. The Nazis threatened a putsch at the first such sentence. The first sentence was carried out on July 24th, but against a 22-year-old socialist after a summary trial. The same day, the police and the Fatherland Front were notified by their spies that the Nazis were going to attack the next day. All the details were given to Fay, but he and Dollfuss spent the evening discussing a possible socialist uprising. The cabinet meeting on July 24th was postponed because of the warning, but no effort was made to protect the ministers. About 1 p.m., 154 Nazis in 8 trucks rushed into the chancellery without a shot being fired. They at once murdered Dollfuss and locked themselves in. Another group of Nazis seized the radio station of Vienna and announced a new government with Rentelen as chancellor. Rentelen as chancellor. There was also sporadic Nazi uprisings in which scores were killed in the provinces. The Nazi Austrian Legion in Germany and the German government did not dare to move because of a stern warning from Mussolini that he would invade Austria from the south if they did. After 6 hours of negotiation, in which Fay and the German minister acted as intermediaries, the besieged men in the chancellery were removed to be deported to Germany. When Dollfuss was found to be dead, 13 were executed and a large number imprisoned. All the Nazi organizations were closed and their activities suspended. At the same time, those who had tried to warn the government against the plot or to prevent it were arrested, and some were killed, including the police spy who had sent the specific details the day before the crime. Schuschnigg and the Heimwehr split the government between them after Dollfuss's death. Each took 4 seats in the cabinet. Schuschnigg was chancellor in the government and vice-chancellor of the Fatherland Front, while Starhemberg was leader of the Fatherland Front and vice-chancellor of the government. From July 34th on, Schuschnigg sought to get rid of the Heimwehr, especially Starhemberg, to create a purely personal dictatorship with only one party, one trade union, and one policy to satisfy the Nazis without yielding any essential power or positions, to keep the socialists crushed, and to get as much support from Mussolini as he could. We have said that Dollfuss and Schuschnigg were faced by 3 opponents in 1932, the Socialists, the Nazis, and the Heimwehr. They sought to destroy these in this order by mobilizing against each the power of ones not yet destroyed. Plus the Christian Socialist. As the effort progressed, they tried to destroy the Christian Socialist as well by driving all groups into a single amorphous and meaningless political party, the Fatherland Front. This party's purpose was to mobilize support for these 2 leaders personally. It had no real political principles and was completely undemocratic, being bound to accept the decisions of the leader. All persons, no matter what their political beliefs, even Nazis, Catholics, communists, and socialists, were forced to join by political, social, and economic pressure. The result was that all political morale was destroyed, public integrity was wrecked, and many among the politically active portions of the population were driven to the 2 underground extremist groups, the Nazis and the Communists, to the former in much larger numbers than to the latter. See, this kind of sounds kind of similar too, where it's like people have lost all morale in the political process, so then they're forming extremist groups, extreme right-wing and extreme left-wing groups, because they don't believe in the political system. Because there was like a one-party, 2-party state, right? Even the socialists, in order to prevent the loss of their angry members to the communists, had to adopt a more revolutionary attitude. Because everything was driven underground and the field was left to meaningless slogans, crass materialist advantages, and pious expressions of righteousness, no one knew what anyone's real thoughts were or whom they could trust. The loss of Italian support for the Heimwehr and for an independent Austria after the Ethiopian affair made it possible for Schuschnigg to get rid of Starhemberg and his militia and made it necessary to conciliate the Nazis. Fay was dropped from the government in October 1935. A political supplement to the Rome Protocols was signed by Austria, Italy, and Hungary on March 23, 1936. It provided that no signer could enter an agreement with a non-signatory state to change the political situation of the Danube area without consultation with the other signers. In April, Austria copied Germany and further alienated France and the Little Entente by decreeing the establishment of general military service. In the same month, Schuschnigg ordered the disarmament of the Catholic militia. In May 1936, 3 Heimwehr members, including Starhemberg, were dropped from the cabinet. A week later, a series of decrees ordered the disarmament of the Heimwehr created an armed militia for the Fatherland Front as the sole armed militia in the country, ordered that in the future the leader of the front and the chancellor must be the same person, gave the chancellor the right to appoint the heads of all local political units and to approve their appointments, prohibited all parades and assemblies until September 30th, and declared that the Fatherland Front was an authoritarian foundation, a legal person, and the sole instrument for the formation of a political will in the state. Thus, strengthened in Austria, and under pressure from Mussolini to make peace with Hitler, Schuschnigg signed an agreement of July 11, 1936, with Franz von Papen, the German minister. According to the published portion of this agreement, Germany recognized Austrian independence and sovereignty. Each country promised not to interfere in the domestic politics of the other. Austria admitted it was a German state, and additional agreements to relieve the existing tension were promised. In secret agreements made at the same time, Austria promised an amnesty for political prisoners, promised to take Nazis into positions of political responsibility, to allow them the same political rights as other Austrians, and also to allow Germans in Austria the same rights to use their national symbols and music as citizens of third states. Both states revoked financial and other restrictions on tourists. Mutual prohibition on each other's newspapers were lifted to the extent that 5 specifically named German papers could enter Austria and 5 named Austrian papers could enter Germany. Other paragraphs promised mutual concessions in regard to economic and cultural relations. Austro-German relations for the next 18 months were dominated by this agreement. Germany, through Papen, trying to extend it bit by bit, while Schuschnigg sought to hold Germany to its recognition of Austrian sovereignty and its promise not to interfere in Austria's domestic political affairs. By the end of that period, Germany was insisting that, since the Austrian Nazis were German, their desires and activities were not an Austrian but a German domestic problem. The secret documents published since 1945 make it quite clear that Germany had no carefully laid plans to annex Austria and was not encouraging violence by the Nazis in Austria. Instead, every effort was made to restrict the Austrian Nazi to propaganda in order to win places in the cabinet and gradually peaceful extension of Nazi influence. At the same time, military measures were held in reserve, prepared for use if necessary. To be sure, wild men on the lower levels of the Nazi Party in Germany were encouraging all kinds of violence in Austria, but this was not true of the real leaders. These ordered von Papen to try to get at least 2 years of peace in 1936, and they removed the Austrian Nazi wild men who opposed this from their positions of leadership. In this way, the violent Tav's plan of the Austrian Nazis was replaced by the Kepler plan of peaceful and gradual penetration through Papen and Austrian politician Arthur von Seyss-Inquart. The invasion of Austria as early as March 12, 1938, and the immediate annexation of Austria were a pleasant surprise even for the Nazi leaders in Germany, and arose from several unexpectedly favorable circumstances. Accordingly, the decision to invade was not made before March 10, 1938, and even then was conditional, while the decision to annex was not made until noon on March 12th by Hitler personally, and was unknown to both Ribbentrop and Göring as late as 10:30 p.m. on March 12th. The circumstances which brought this unexpected speed up in the German plans were based on two facts. One, the international situation, and two, the events in Austria. We shall discuss these in order. As far as the obvious political events are concerned, 1937 was the only quiet year after 1933. But the capture and release of various secret documents now make it clear that 1937 was a critical turning point because in that year, the German government and British government made secret decisions which sealed the fate of Austria and Czechoslovakia and dominated the history of the next 3 years. The decision made by the German government, that is, by Hitler, was to prepare for open military aggression against Czechoslovakia and Austria and to carry this out before 1943 to 1945, probably in 1938. This decision was announced by Hitler to a secret meeting of 7 persons on November 5, 1937. Among those present, besides Hitler and his aide, Colonel Hossbach, there were the Minister of War, Werner von Blumberg, the Commanders-in-Chief of the Army, Werner von Fritsch, the Navy, Erich Raeder, and the Air Force, Hermann Göring, and the German Minister, Konstantin von Neurath. It is evident from some of Hitler's statements that he had already received certain information about the secret decisions being made by Chamberlain on the British side. For example, he said flatly that Britain wanted to satisfy the colonial ambitions of Germany by giving it non-British areas like Portuguese Angola, something which we now know was in Chamberlain's mind. Hitler further assured his listeners that almost certainly Britain, and probably France as well, had already tacitly written off the Czechs and were reconciled to the fact that this question would be cleared up in due course by Germany. An attack by France without British support and with the prospect of the offensive being brought to a standstill on our western fortifications was hardly probable. Nor was a French march through Belgium and Holland without British support to be expected. In Spain, especially in the Balearic Islands, the French African troops could be kept from crossing the Mediterranean Sea for use in Europe, and in general that France and Britain would be so tied down in the Mediterranean by Italy that they would take no action against Germany over Czechoslovakia and Austria. In fact, Hitler was so sure of an Anglo-French war against Italy in 1938 that he was confident Czechoslovakia and Austria could be conquered by Germany in that year. These ideas were completely unacceptable to Blumberg, Fritsch, and Neurath. They objected that German rearmament was so backward that they did not have a single motorized division capable of movement, that there was no reason to expect an Anglo-French-Italian war in 1938, that Italy, in such a war, could tie down only 20 French divisions, leaving more than enough to attack Germany, and that such an attack would be very dangerous because Germany's fortifications on her western frontier were insignificant. Hitler brushed these objections aside. He repeated his previous statements that he was convinced of Britain's non-participation, and therefore he did not believe in the probability of belligerent action by France against Germany. As a result of the opposition from Blumberg, Fritsch, and Neurath, in his conference of November 1937, Hitler replaced these three by more amenable subordinates in a sudden coup on February 4, 1938. Hitler himself took the posts of Minister of War and Commander-in-Chief, with General Wilhelm Keitel as Chief of Staff for all the armed forces of the Reich, Neurath was replaced in the foreign ministry by the fanatical Ribbentrop. The very able Dirksen was sent to London as ambassador, but his ability was wasted as Ribbentrop paid no attention to his reports and his well-founded warnings. In the meantime, the British government, especially the small group controlling foreign policy, had reached a 7-point decision regarding their attitude towards Germany. 1. Hitler Germany was the frontline bulwark against the spread of communism in Europe. 2. A four-power pact of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany to exclude all Russian influence from Europe was the ultimate aim. Accordingly, Britain had no desire to weaken the Rome-Berlin axis, but regarded it and the Anglo-French Entente as the foundation of a stable Europe. 3. Britain had no objection to German acquisition of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Danzig. 4. Germany must not use force to achieve its aims in Europe, as this would precipitate a war in which Britain would have to intervene because of the pressure of public opinion in Britain and the French system of alliances. With patience, Germany could get its aims without using force. 5. Britain wanted an agreement with Germany restricting the number and the use of bombing planes. 6. Britain was prepared to give Germany colonial areas in South Central Africa, including the Belgian Congo and Portuguese Angola, if Germany would renounce its desire to recover Tanzania, which had been taken from Germany in 1919, and if Germany would sign an international agreement to govern these areas with due regard for the rights of the natives, an open-door commercial policy, and under some mechanism of international supervision like the mandates. 7. Britain would use pressure on Czechoslovakia and Poland to negotiate with Germany and to be conciliatory to Germany's desires. To these 7 points, we should add an 8th. Britain must rearm in order to maintain its position in the three-bloc world, and to deter Germany from using force in creating its own bloc in Europe. This point was supported by Chamberlain, who built up the Air Force which saved Britain in 1940, and by the Round Table Group, led by Lord Lothian, Edward Grigg, and Leopold Amery, who put on a campaign to establish compulsory military service. The first 7 points were reiterated to Germany by various spokesmen from 1937 onward. They are also to be found in many recently published documents, including the captured archives of the German Foreign Ministry, the documents of the British Foreign Office, and various extracts from diaries and other private papers, especially extracts from Neville Chamberlain's diary and his letters to his sister. Among numerous other occasions, these points were covered in the following cases: A conversation between Lord Halifax and Hitler at Berchtesgaden on November 17, 1938. B. In a letter from Neville Chamberlain to his sister on November 26, 1937. C. In a conversation between Hitler, Ribbentrop, and the British ambassador, Sir Neville Henderson, in Berlin on March 3, 1938. D. In a series of conversations involving Lord Halifax, Ribbentrop, Sir Thomas Inskip, British Minister of Defence, Eric Court, Ribbentrop's assistant, and Sir Horace Wilson, Chamberlain's personal representative, in London on March 11, 1938, and E. In a conference of Neville Chamberlain with various North American journalists held at Lord Astor's house on May 10, 1938. In addition, portions of these 7 points were mentioned or discussed in scores of conversations and documents which are now available. Certain significant features of these should be pointed out. In the first place, in spite of persistent British efforts lasting for more than 2 years, Hitler rejected Angola or the Congo and insisted on the return of German colonies which had been lost in 1919. During 1939, Germany steadily refused to negotiate on this issue and finally refused to even acknowledge the British efforts to discuss it. In the second place, the British, throughout these discussions, made a sharp distinction between Germany's aims and Germany's methods. They had no objections to Germany's aims in Europe, but they insisted that Germany must not use force to achieve these aims because of the danger of war. This distinction was accepted by the German professional diplomats and by the German professional soldiers, who were quite willing to obtain Germany's aims by peaceful means, but this distinction was not accepted by the leaders of the Nazi Party, especially Hitler, Ribbentrop, and Himmler, who were too impatient and who wanted to prove themselves to themselves and the world that Germany was powerful enough to take what it wanted without waiting for anybody's permission. These wild men were encouraged in this attitude by their belief that Britain and France were so decadent that they would stand for anything, and by their failure to see the role played by public opinion in England. Convinced that the governing group in England wanted Germany to get Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Danzig, they could not understand why there was such an emphasis on using peaceful methods, and they could not see how British public opinion could force the British government to go to war over the methods used when the British government made it perfectly clear that the last thing that they wanted was a war. This error was based on the fact that these Nazis had no idea of how a democratic government works and had no respect for public opinion or free press, and were encouraged in their error by the weakness of the British ambassador in Berlin and by Ribbentrop's association with the Cliveden set in England while he had been ambassador there in 1936 to 1938. In the third place, the British government could not publicly admit to its own people these 7 points because they were not acceptable to British public opinion. Accordingly, these points had to remain secret except for various trial balloons issued through the Times in speeches in the House of Commons or in Chatham House, in articles in the Round Table, and by calculated indiscretions to prepare the ground for what was being done. See, you notice how they do that. Then these trial balloons, they're basically like, we'll just talk about it a little bit and see how badly people respond to it. And then usually over time, as they introduce the idea over time, people just get used to it, right? Because it's like at first they're like, oh, we're gonna do like stop and search, frisk everybody because after 9/11, right? There's terrorists. And at first people are like, no, we don't want to do that. But then they're like, well, what if we just stop and search Muslim people? Then they're like, that sounds better. That sounds better, right? And then they're like, we're just going to do the stop and search law. We're going to put stop and search into law. But for right now, we're only going to do it to Muslim people. And then like 10 years later, white people are like, well, wait a minute. Now they're doing it to us too. Oh crap. We shouldn't have let them make that law. But then it's like too late. In order to persuade the British people to accept these points one by one as they were achieved, the British government spread the tale that Germany was armed to the teeth and that the opposition to Germany was insignificant. This propaganda first appeared in the effusions of the Round Table groups, whose leader, Lord Lothian, had visited Hitler in January 1935 and had been pushing this 7-point program in the Times, in the Round Table, at Chatham House and All Souls, and with Lord Halifax. In December 1937, in the December 1937 issue of the Round Table, where most of the 7 points which Halifax had just discussed with Hitler were mentioned, a war to prevent Germany's ambitions in Europe was rejected on the grounds that its outcome is uncertain and that it would entail objectionable domestic disasters. What, so you only go to war when you know that you're going to win? Like, that's ridiculous. We're like, well, we'll do a war if we're going to win. But if we don't know if we're going to win, then maybe it's like maybe you should do a war only when it's justified. Adding up the balance of military forces in such a war, it gave a preponderance to Germany by omitting both Russia and Czechoslovakia and by estimating the French army at only 2/3 the size of German and placing the British army at less than 3 divisions. By the spring of 1938, this completely erroneous view of the situation was being propagated by the government itself. For years before June 1938, the government insisted that British rearming was progressing in a satisfactory fashion. Churchill and others questioned this and produced figures on German rearmament to prove that Britain's own progress in this field was inadequate. These figures, which were not correct, were denied by the government and their own rearmament defended. As late as March 1938, Chamberlain said that British armament were such as to make Britain an almost terrifying power on the opinion of the world. But as the year went on, the government adopted a quite different attitude. In order to persuade public opinion that it was necessary to yield to Germany, the government and its supporters pretended that its armaments were quite inadequate in comparison with Germany. See what I'm saying? It's like they always do the, you gotta be afraid. They're gonna kill us. They're gonna kill us. So we've gotta go and kill them first. And you've gotta let us build as many bombs, guns, planes, and what other military stuff we need as much as possible right now. We know, thanks to the capture papers of the German Ministry of War, that this was a gross exaggeration. From 1936 to the outbreak of war in 1939, German aircraft production was not raised, but averaged 425 planes a month of all types, including commercial. Its tank production was low, and even in 1939 was less than Britain's. In the first 9 months of 1939, Germany produced only 50 tanks a month. In the last 4 months of 1939, in wartime, Germany produced 247 tanks and self-propelled guns, compared to the British production of 314 tanks in the same period. At the time of the Munich crisis in 1938, Germany had 35 infantry and 4 motorized divisions, none of them fully manned or equipped. At that time, Czechoslovakia could mobilize at least 33 divisions. Moreover, the Czech army was better trained, had far better equipment, and had better morale and better fortifications. At that time, Germany's tanks were all below 10 tons and were armed with machine guns, except for a handful of 18-ton tanks, Mark III, armed with a 37-millimeter gun. The Czechs had hundreds of 38-ton tanks armed with 75-millimeter cannons. In March 1939, when Germany overran Czechoslovakia, it had captured 469 of these superior tanks, along with 1,500 planes, 43,000 machine guns, and over 1 million rifles. From every point of view, this was little less than Germany had at Munich, and at Munich, if the British government had desired it, Germany's 39 divisions, with the possible assistance of Poland and Hungary, would have been opposed by Czechoslovakia's 34 divisions, supported by France, Britain, and Russia. Before leaving this subject, it should perhaps be mentioned that Germany in 1939 brought into production a Mark IV tank of 23 tons, armed with a 75mm cannon, but obtained only 300 of the Mark III and Mark IV together before the outbreak of the war in September 1939. In addition, it had obtained by the same date 2,700 of the inferior Mark I and Mark II tanks, which suffered breakdowns of as much as 25% a week. At this same date, September 1939, Germany had an air force of 1,000 bombers and 1,050 fighters. In contrast with this, the British air program of March 1934, which emphasized fighter planes, was to provide at first line force of 900 planes. This was stepped up under the urging of Chamberlain, and the program of May 1938 was planned to provide a first line force of 2,370 planes. This was raised up again in 1939. Under it, Britain produced almost 3,000 military planes in 1938, and about 8,000 in 1939, compared to 3,000 combat planes produced in Germany in 1938, and 4,700 in 1939. Moreover, the quality of British planes was superior to that of Germany's. It was this margin which made it possible for Britain to defeat Germany in the Battle of Britain in September 1940. From these facts, it is quite clear that Britain did not yield to superior force in 1938, as was stated at the time and has been stated since by many writers, including Winston Churchill, whose war memoirs were written 2 years after the Reichswar archives were captured. We have evidence that Chamberlain government knew these facts but consistently gave a We have evidence that the Chamberlain government knew these facts but consistently gave a contrary impression, and that Lord Halifax went so far in this direction as to call forth protests from the British military attaches in Prague and Paris. The Chamberlain government made it clear to Germany both publicly and privately that they would not oppose Germany's projects. As Dirksen wrote to Ribbentrop on June 8, 1938, anything which cannot be got without a shot being fired can count upon this agreement of the British. Accordingly, it was clear that Britain would not oppose the annexation of Austria, although they continued to warn vigorously against any effort to use force. In February 1938, Sir John Simon and Chamberlain announced in the House of Commons that neither the League of Nations nor Great Britain could be expected to support Austrian independence. On February 12th, Hitler told Schuschnigg that Lord Halifax agreed with everything Hitler did with respect to Austria and to the Sudeten Germans. On March 3rd, Neville Henderson told Hitler that changes in Europe were acceptable if accomplished without the free play of force, and that he personally had often expressed himself in favor of the Anschluss. Finally, on March 7th, when the crisis was at its height, Chamberlain in the House of Commons refused to guarantee Austria or any small nation. This statement was made to the cheers of the government supporters. The following day, the Foreign Office sent a message to its mission in Europe in which it stated its inability to guarantee protection to Austria. This made it so clear to Hitler that Britain would not move that his orders to invade Austria also ordered no precautions to be taken by the defense forces on Germany's other frontiers. March 11, 1938. In fact, Hitler was considerably more worried about Italy than he was about Britain and France, in spite of Mussolini's agreement of September 1937 to support Germany's ambitions in Austria in return for German support of his ambitions in the Mediterranean. Although the international stage had been set, the invasion and annexation would not have come about in March had it not been for the conditions in Austria, especially Schuschnigg's determination to prevent the execution of the Kepler plan for Nazi penetration of the Austrian government. As soon as he extended one concession, he took away another, so that the Nazi position became a bitter joke. At last, Papen persuaded Schuschnigg to visit Hitler at Berchtesgaden on February 12, 1938. There, the Austrian Chancellor was upbraided by an enraged Hitler and forced to sign a new agreement which did much to fulfill the Kepler plan. Although no ultimatum was given to Schuschnigg, it was made quite clear that if peaceful methods did not work, warlike ones would be used. Schuschnigg promised, 1. To appoint Seyss-Inquart, a Nazi, as Minister of Security with unlimited control of the police in Austria, 2. To release from prison and to restore to their positions all Nazis who were being held, including the rebels of July 1934, 3. To exchange 100 army officers with Germany, 4. To permit Nazis in Austria to profess their creed and join the Fatherland Front with the same rights as others, the Nazi Party to remain illegal. In return, Hitler repeated the agreement of July 11, 1936. On his return to Austria, Schuschnigg put these concessions into effect piecemeal without any public statement, but he was still determined to resist. On March 2nd, he began to negotiate with the long outlawed socialist groups, and on March 9th, he suddenly announced a plebiscite for Sunday, March 13th. This plebiscite, as planned, was completely unfair. There was only one question, which asked the voter, are you for a free and German independent and social, Christian and united Austria, for peace and work, for the equality of all those who affirm themselves, for the people and the fatherland? There were no voting lists. Only yes ballots were to be provided by the government. Anyone wishing to vote no had to provide his own ballot, the same size as the yes ballots, with nothing on it but the word no. The Nazis were outraged. Through Seyss-Inquart, Hitler sent an ultimatum that the plebiscite must be postponed and replaced by one in which the opposite point of view, union with Germany, could be expressed as well. As the day passed, March 11th, these German demands were increased. In the afternoon, as the German army was marching towards the frontier, came the demand for Schuschnigg to resign and for Seyss-Inquart to become chancellor. If an affirmative answer came before 7:30 p.m., the invasion was to be stopped. Schuschnigg resigned, but President Miklas refused to name Seyss-Inquart chancellor until 11 p.m. By that time, the German by that time the Germany forces by that time the German forces were crossing the border, and their advance could not be stopped. Orders had been given to the Austrians not to resist, and the Germans were generally welcomed. Goring demanded a telegram from Seyss-Inquart asking for German troops to restore order and thus justify the invasion. He never got it, so he wrote one himself. The lack of resistance, the welcome from the Austrians, and the inaction of Italy and the Western powers encouraged the Germans to increase their ambitions. During most of March 12th, they were talking about an early withdrawal after the Seyss-Inquart government was established, but the uproarious welcome given Hitler at Linz on that day, the need for such Austrian products as wool, the manpower available in Austria's 500,000 unemployed, the opportunity to plunder the Jews, and the complete lack of opposition decided Hitler to annex Austria. Wow, that was like one of the worst sentences in the whole book. Decided Hitler to annex Austria? What is that even English? The complete lack of opposition decided Hitler to annex Austria? Come on. I mean, all right. This was done on March 13th, and a plebiscite was ordered for April 10th to approve the action. In the meantime, those who had opposed the Nazis were murdered or enslaved, the Jews were plundered and abused, and extravagant honors were paid to the Nazi gangsters who had been disturbing Austria for years. The plebiscite of April 10th, under great pressure from the Nazis, showed over 99% of the Germans in favor of the Anschluss. Okay. That's the end of that section on page 625. The next section is going to be the Czechoslovak crisis, 1937 to 1938. We will get to that next time. So, yeah, I mean, again, you can see a lot of what either led up to or allowed Germany to do World War II was the actions or inactions of France and Germany, and France and England, just kind of standing idly by, because again, England didn't want any centralized power in Europe. They didn't want either France or Germany to be like a central power, and France didn't want Germany to have more power because they're right next door to them, right? So it's actually a physical threat. And so Germany was kind of catching on to the game, basically, as you could say, that England was kind of bluffing and France was kind of bluffing because they didn't really want to go to a war. And Germany, which at the time had nothing to lose, so them going to a war could only benefit them, where like France and England, they had stuff to lose. So you can see why, Germany assumed that they could kind of win the war. And then once they saw that, England and France weren't really going to back up a lot of these smaller countries like Poland, Austria, that they could just kind of invade them. And as long as they didn't do too much like outright violence, then England and France wouldn't do anything about it. Even though they all had alliances formed that they weren't supposed to do any more wars after World War I, right? So it's kind of interesting. I mean, I kind of knew the basic stuff. It's like basically, it's like that's the way I look at it. It's like there was just one world war in Europe, right? And it was just they just took a break in between World War I and World War II. It was really just a break. They were like recouping and regrouping. But this is a much more nuanced way to look at it for sure. So I'm going to get out of here with that. Thanks for watching the video. If you did, if you didn't, you won't hear this. Otherwise, have a good day and peace.